The Tooth Gnasher Super Flash by Daniel Pinkwater. To Alf, who keeps the old green thunderclap going. Mr. Pop Snorkel decided it was time to buy a new car. His old car, a green thunderclap 8, was just about worn out. So Mr. Pop Snorkel and Mrs. Pop Snorkel and the 5 little Pop Snorkels all got into the worn-out green Thunderclap 8 and went looking for a nice new car. They drove down the highway where all the car dealers were and looked at all the signs and shiny new cars in the window. "Look," shouted the 5 little Pop Snorkels, "the Tooth Gnasher Super Flash. That's a great car." "It is a pretty color," said Mrs. Pop Snorkel. It was a light blue. Mr. Pop Snorkel turned into the parking lot of the Tooth Gnasher car dealer. A salesman came out. "I am Mr. Sandy," said the car salesman. "May I show you the new Tooth Gnasher Super Flash? We only have one left." "Is it the light blue one?" Mrs. Pop Snorkel asked. Mr. Pop Snorkel and Mrs. Pop Snorkel and the 5 little Pop Snorkels and Mr. Sandy, the car salesman, all got into the Tooth Gnasher Super Flash. Mr. Sandy drove, and Mr. Pop Snorkel sat next to him. Mrs. Pop Snorkel and the 5 little Pop Snorkels all sat in the back seat. "See how smooth it rides?" said Mr. Sandy. "We love this car," shouted the 5 little Pop Snorkels. "Buy it, Daddy." "It is a beautiful light blue," Mrs. Pop Snorkel said. "Would it be all right if I drove the car for a while?" Mr. Pop Snorkel asked Mr. Sandy, the car salesman. Mr. Sandy pulled over to the side of the road and got out and opened the door for Mrs. Pop Snorkel, who got in the front seat with Mr. Pop Snorkel, who had moved over behind the steering wheel. Mr. Sandy, the car salesman, got in the back seat with the 5 little Pop Snorkels. Perhaps he hold on. We're stuck here. The pages are stuck together. You wouldn't think that of this book, but it is. There we go. "Yay!" shouted the 5 little Pop Snorkels. "Daddy's going to drive the Tooth Gnasher Super Flash." Mr. Pop Snorkel started the Tooth Gnasher Super Flash. It roared out onto the highway. The tires squealed. Other drivers honked their horns. Maggie was very excited. "Yay!" the 5 little Pop Snorkels shouted. "Perhaps you shouldn't drive quite so fast until you are used to the car," Mr. Sandy, the car salesman, said. "What does this button do?" Mr. Pop Snorkel asked as he pushed a button on the dashboard. The Tooth Gnasher Super Flash rose up on its rear wheels and zoomed along the highway with its nose high in the air. Merlin, of course, got very excited too. "This is very nice," Mr. Pop Snorkel said. "And what does this button do?" He pushed another button, and the car began to rock side to side on its rear wheels. Then the rear wheels turned into little legs, and the car turned into a dinosaur running on its hind legs. Merlin, of course, is still very excited. "Fine," said Mr. Pop Snorkel. "I like a car that turns into a dinosaur. And what does this button do?" And he pushed another button. The dinosaur put his nose down near the road and began to run on all fours. Then the Tooth Gnasher Super Flash turned into a galloping elephant. "Yay!" the 5 little Pop Snorkels shouted. "It turns into an elephant too, dear," Mrs. Pop Snorkel said. To Mr. Pop Snorkel, "That's very nice, dear," said Mrs. Pop Snorkel, "and such a lovely color. But do you have to go so fast?" "Of course not," Mr. Pop Snorkel said. Now let's see what this button does. He pushed another button and the Tooth Gnasher Super Flash changed from a galloping elephant to a gigantic turtle. Yes, Merlin thinks I have a very dirty brain. My goodness, this really is a good car, Mr. Pop Snorkel said, and it turns into a dinosaur and an elephant and a turtle. Can it do anything else? I really don't know, said Mr. Sandy the car salesman. I've never had a car turn into a dinosaur or an elephant or a turtle before. This is not the way this Tooth Gnasher Super Flash is supposed to behave. Well, it's just the way I think a car should behave, said Mr. Pop Snorkel. The only thing I'd like this car to do besides turning into a dinosaur and an elephant and a gigantic turtle would be to turn into a huge chicken and fly. Mr. Pop Snorkel found another button on the dashboard and pushed it. The Tooth Gnasher Super Flash turned into a huge chicken and flew all the way back to the car dealer. This is a first-class car, said Mr. Pop Snorkel. We'll take it. Yay! Shouted the 5 little Pop Snorkels. It certainly is a lovely color, said Mrs. Pop Snorkel. I never saw a car do any of those things, said Mr. Sandy the car salesman. Mr. Pop Snorkel and Mrs. Pop Snorkel and the 5 little Pop Snorkels traded in their worn-out green Thunderclap 8 and gave Mr. Sandy lots of money. They drove away in their new light blue Tooth Gnasher Super Flash. Yay! We have our new car, the 5 little Pop Snorkels shouted. It really is a lovely color, said Mrs. Pop Snorkel. It is a nice car, all right, said Mr. Pop Snorkel, but it can't do half the things our good old Thunderclap 8 could do. The end.